The Battle of Thermopylae was fought in 480 BCE between the Persians and the Greeks led by Sparta under King Leonidas. This battle, sometimes known as the 300, would become an iconic moment for Western civilization all the way up until today. A century later, a man named Philip of Macedon would go on to unite the Greek city-states into the Hellenic League and finally give back to Persia what has been dished to them for so long. The Persians were the globalist empire of the time period. The king of the Persians was known as the King of Kings. For example, Xerxes had titles such as Great King, Pharaoh of Egypt, King of all countries, King of Babylon, King of Kings. And so, a real-life Game of Thrones followed. The last ruler of this line would be Darius III. And just before Philip invaded Persia, he would get murdered, and his son Alexander would take control of the soon-to-be Macedonian Empire. Alexander would be the hegemon of the Hellenic League that his father Philip started, and he would also become the Pharaoh of Egypt, King of Persia, King of Kings, if you will. Alexander's empire would span all the way from India to the Mediterranean. He had plans to go into Rome and into Arabia. In fact, while Alexander was on campaigns in the east, his uncle, also named Alexander, was already invading Italy, and he failed and was killed. After making a treaty with the Romans, he had one successful victory over the Samnites, but was killed by the Lucanians at the Battle of Pandosia. After his death, he was succeeded by Antiquity, the cousin of Alexander, and he would be the first satrap of the Kingdom of Epirus. This would be important for the rise of Rome. When Alexander dies, the empire is divided up and sliced up into satrapies, in the same way that Cyrus had his kingdom laid out. Except at this point in time, there is no King of Kings, if you will. So the Game of Thrones begins at this moment. Before Alexander the Great was even laid to rest, his body was being taken back to Macedon in a giant tomb on wheels, carried by horses and Bacchanals playing flutes and singers and dancers. It was a scene to be held. Aridaeus had the honors of taking Alexander back to Macedon to his mother Olympias, who at this point in time was closest thing you're going to get to a queen of the world. But just as Aridaeus was on his way to get through Turkey, Ptolemy, the savior, son of Lagus, intercepted the tomb and brought it down to Egypt, where he would have Alexander placed with who he thought was the real father of Alexander, which was Nectanebo. This story would be placed in the Alexander romance. Perdiccas, the regent of Babylon, was furious after this, so he went down to fight against Ptolemy for the body of Alexander. But Ptolemy would be the one to defeat Perdiccas. The Diadochi is officially underway. Alexander's generals are now at war. It's time to choose a side. I can do an entire 3 to 4 hour video just in the next 5 years span. But to save time for the topic of this video, I'm going to skip ahead and to let you know that when the dust settles, we end up with Lysimachus in control of Thrace and Phrygia. Antipater died at age 81, was succeeded by Cassander. Cassander would be the one to arrest and murder the mother of Alexander the Great, Olympias. As Antipater grew close to his death in 319, he transferred the regency of Macedon not to Cassander, but to Polyperchon, possibly so not to alarm the other Diadochi through an apparent move towards dynastic ambition. Cassander, however, rejected his father's decision and immediately went to seek support of Antigonus the One-Eyed, the general of Alexander, along with Ptolemy and Lysimachus, to forge the strongest allyship between these four. This would not last long, as Seleucus I had plans of his own to be the next king of kings and control Babylon, and he was extremely successful, defeating battle after battle. The Seleucid Empire would rise and control all of Persia, most of Mesopotamia. Antigonus, who was the satrap of Phrygia, made an attempt to make a new division following the death of Perdiccas by the hands of Ptolemy. The partition Triparadisus was a deal struck in 321 BCE. However, only 2 years later, Antipater was killed and the Second Diadochi War began. Cassander would stand out in these wars as being the most hostile to the memory of Alexander because of what he did to his mother and how he was opposed by the kingdom of Epirus, the last stand of remnant from Philip and Olympias. He would have Alexander IV, Roxana, and all of Alexander's supposed illegitimate sons executed, and lied to Olympias when he said that he would spare her life. He would then move the capital from Pella to Thessalonica, which he named after his wife. It would be the Antigonids who would get the revenge. Demetrius of Macedon, the son of Antigonus the One-Eyed, served as the highest general under both Philip and Alexander. I will be doing an entire video on Demetrius. He would even be worshipped in his lifetime and be given the title of Savior, Soter. He would be the next hegemon of the Hellenic League after Alexander himself because of his success against Cassander, Seleucus, and Lysimachus, who were united to destroy him and his father. These armies met at the Battle of Ipsus in Phrygia in 301 BC. Antigonus was killed, and Demetrius, after sustaining severe losses, retired to Ephesus. Plutarch gives an amazing story about his life, ups and downs, but to make a long story short for this video, by the year 294 BCE, he finally establishes himself on the throne of Macedonia by murdering Alexander V, the son of Cassander, and faced the rebellion, but was able to restore the League of Hellas. This was when finally the dust was settling after the Third Diadochi, later be known by historians as the Kingdoms of the Diadochi, or the Hellenistic period, from 275 to 30 BCE, when Augustus would take control and win the Game of Thrones. But the question is, how does somebody from Rome win this Game of Thrones and not somebody from Macedonia? As I mentioned, the dust has finally settled. Lysimachus is in control in the north, Kingdom of Epirus in the west, Seleucids control of Asia, and Ptolemy is in control of Egypt. Demetrius was a god in his lifetime. People thought that he was the god Dionysus. Plutarch compares him to Mark Antony, and there's a lot of good reasons for this. Both of their lucks would run out before they could even become as great as they were supposed to be. In 288 BCE, Demetrius was totally forsaken by his troops on the field of the battle, and he surrendered to Seleucus. Seleucus would let him live in the court in Babylon. However, he died as a drunken decadent not long after this. There are many tragedies and plays and operas dedicated to his life. Which brings us to the next chapter of this story, Pyrrhus of Epirus. A direct descendant from Alexander's dynasty. He would do what Alexander's uncle tried to do and go and invade Italy once and for all. However, even though he kind of did win the war against Rome, it was called a Pyrrhic victory, named after him, which means he sort of wasted a lot of resources on this battle to the point where it's almost as if Rome actually won. But as a result of these wars, Pyrrhus would take control of Syracuse in Sicily, a very rich kingdom, since the time of Dion and Dionysus during the time of Plato. This was a strategic point in the Mediterranean world to control. Seleucus was now calling himself the King of Kings. Seleucus nominated his son Antiochus I as co-ruler and viceroy of the eastern provinces in 292, the vast extent of the empire seeming to require a double government. Royal marriages were put in place. The alliance between Lysimachus, Ptolemy, and Seleucus would start to fall apart. Eventually, Lysimachus ruled Macedonia, Thrace, and Asia Minor. The unpopularity of Lysimachus after the murder of Agathocles gave Seleucus an opportunity to remove his last rival. It was down to 3 now: Ptolemy, Seleucus, and Lysimachus. And it all comes down to the year 281 BCE. In a true Game of Thrones style, Ptolemy Caranus would be the breakout superstar of this story. This is where shit gets crazy. Ptolemy Caranus, whose name means thunderbolt, known to be impatient and a destructive character. He was the eldest son of Ptolemy Soter, the king of Egypt, born around 319 BCE. He was in line to be the next king of Egypt and king of the Ptolemies. However, because of his destructive character, Ptolemy chose the second son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, to be the heir of the throne. Because of this, Ptolemy Caranus angrily left the kingdom and went to Seleucus. Following his departure from Egypt, Ptolemy Caranus went to the court of Lysimachus, who was ruling in Macedon and Thrace and Asia Minor. Lysimachus's court was divided on the question of if they should support Caranus or not. On one hand, Lysimachus himself was married to Ptolemy II's sister, Arsinoe II. On the other hand, Lysimachus's heir, Agathocles, was married to Caranus's full sister, Lysandra. Lysimachus ultimately chose to support Ptolemy II and sealed that decision at some point between 284 and 281 by marrying his daughter Arsinoe to Ptolemy II. This is where things get crazy. The course of events of how this played out is very unclear, and it's almost going to sound unbelievable, but Ptolemy Caranus by himself was able to carry out the murder of Agathocles, which led to Seleucus invading Lysimachus's territory and then defeating Lysimachus, which brings us to only 2 people left in all of the Diadochi, Seleucus and Ptolemy. And Ptolemy's son then murdered Seleucus behind his back because he thought he had his support. Caranus was placed in the court of Seleucus following his help against Lysimachus, but seeing the opportunity to gain, Ptolemy Caranus was able to kill Seleucus and become the king of Macedonia. So within 1 year, the year 281 BCE, both Lysimachus and Seleucus are now dead, and Ptolemy the Savior, Ptolemy Soter, is the last standing general, the last king of all the Diadochi. He's kind of the winner of this Game of Thrones. But obviously, it's not over yet. There's still this tension between son and father. And so, Ptolemy Coronis was the king of Macedon for 2 years, from 281 to 279. And in January of 279, a group of Gauls, led by Bulgius, invaded Macedonia from the north. And Ptolemy Coronis was killed in this invasion. And that was the end of this sporadic and almost unbelievable turn of events in the Diadochi. Meleager was the brother of Ptolemy Coronis, also being the son of Ptolemy Soter, and he would rule Macedonia for only 2 months before Cassander's son, Antipater, would take back Macedonia from the Ptolemies, when it just looked like it was about to be a world Ptolemaic empire. Cassander's son got it back. And that is the end of the Ptolemies in Macedonia. Antiochus the Soter succeeded Seleucus and would reign for 20 years and get the title King of the Universe, King of Kings, and thus the Seleucid Empire would stay extremely stable until the rise of Rome. And the Ptolemies would stay extremely stable down in Egypt until the time of Rome. So, to conclude this kind of chapter of this Game of Thrones that we're talking about here, Seleucids and Ptolemies settle the dust, and these are the two empires that would play tug-of-war for the next 200 years. Macedonia, though, would engage with Rome on one front, as Rome engages with Carthage on another front. The kingdom that was put in place by Pyrrhus in Syracuse was taken over by the Romans, who defeated Archimedes at the siege of Syracuse in 212 BCE. The rise of the Roman Republic would ensue from this, and Carthage would now be on the front of this war against Rome. Hannibal is the next rising star that needs to be mentioned immediately. Born in 247 BCE, he was a Carthaginian general and statesman who commanded the forces of Carthage in the battles against the Roman Republic. He is arguably the greatest military commander in world history. Even after being defeated, he cannot die. It's almost as if he lives forever. And it seems that way because his name just keeps popping up over and over again, even after it seems like he's defeated. Siege of Saguntum, Second Punic War, Battle of Rome Crossing, Battle of Nola, Battle of Ticinus, 3 battles of Nola, Battle of Trebia, Battle of Tarentum, Battle of Lake Tristan, Battle of Cope, Battle of Numidia, 2 battles of Hermanonia, Battle of Canusium, Battle of Crotona, Battle of Tarentum, the Battle of Zama. And finally, when Scipio was able to defeat Hannibal, he didn't kill him. Hannibal still goes and leaves Carthage and becomes allied with the Seleucids against Macedonia and Rome. As I said, he's indestructible. Hannibal does not die. He would live out his days in Turkey, in the location where a new Mithridatic empire would rise up. It would be at this time when Rome would have control of all of the Western Mediterranean, finally taking control of Carthage and Spain and setting their sights to the east now, and squaring off with the famous Macedonians. Lucius Aemilius Paulus Macedonicus, a 2-time consul of the Roman Republic, conquered Macedonia in the Third Macedonian War. The Third Macedonian War was fought between Rome and King Perseus of Macedon, the final successor of the Macedonians that goes all the way back to Philip and Alexander. and Antigonus the One-Eyed. And when Philip V of Macedon was killed, he was succeeded by Perseus. Perseus was the last king of the Antigonid dynasty and the last Macedonian who can trace his roots back to the time of Alexander. As I mentioned, he was defeated by Lucius Aemilius Paulus, but was able to live in the court at Rome and live out the rest of his days in good conditions and very famous as well. This was the end of the Greeks and the beginning of Rome. The Seleucid Empire would slowly get sandwiched in by the Romans and the Parthians as the descendants of Ptolemy would stand by in Egypt and watch as their enemies would fall to Rome. Jugurtha was the grandson of the first Numidian king Massinissa, who ruled from 202 to 148 BCE and funded Hannibal against the Romans. Gaius Marius, one of the old Roman Republic heroes who served as consul for many years, squared off against Jugurtha, whose father supported Hannibal and assisted him in the Battle of Zama in the Second Punic War. Jugurtha and his family had been long enemies of Rome. Marius and Sulla would team up to defeat Jugurtha. With the surrender of Jugurtha and the end of the war, Marius returned to Rome in triumph, where he would be elected consul unprecedentedly for every year from 104 to 101 BCE, something never been done before. And after a brief celebration of his triumph, Marius marched northward. Sulla would join him, which begins the climax and topic of today's video. And yeah, that was a long lead up, but it was fun, wasn't it? Right? Anyways, Sulla would join him, where he would defeat the rebellious Germanic tribes in 102 BCE. Despite these victories over Jugurtha and the Germanic tribes, these two men, Marius and Sulla, would soon become the first archenemies and civil war veterans of Rome. This would set the tone for the end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the Roman Empire. There's a reason why I chose Sulla to be on the thumbnail of this video, to be the main character of this story. Because most people, when you're telling this Game of Thrones tale that really happened on planet Earth, usually start off with Alexander the Great and end somehow with Augustus, which is fine. I'm totally okay with that. But there needs to be credit where credit is due, and that's Sulla. Here's what Plutarch has to say in his Lives of the jealousy and how Sulla had reveled in after their return to Rome. Marius triumphed, but the glory of the enterprise, which through the people's envy of Marius was ascribed to Sulla, secretly grieved him. And the truth is, Sulla himself was by nature vainglorious, and this being the first time that from a low and private condition he had risen to esteem amongst the citizens. Sulla is the Caesar before Caesar. After a series of well-placed bribes and moves, Sulla would climb the political ladder by securing the position of Praetor Urbanus in 97 BCE, and later the proconsul to Silica, where he would remain until 92 BCE, which brings us to the Social War. And here's where things start to turn for the Roman Republic. The jealousy and hatred would only deepen between Marius and Sulla. The social war of allies from 91 to 88 BCE saw Rome face a revolt among the city's previously loyal allies in Italy, who demanded equal rights and citizenship. The war would end when Rome conceded to most of their demands by establishing a reputation for ruthlessness and brutality in the war. Sulla became Rome's first general, a distinction Marius had previously held. Plutarch again gives us more insight. After the war, Marius was unable to render any great service and proved that military excellence requires a man's highest strength and vigor. Sulla, on the other hand, did much that was memorable and achieved the reputation of a great leader among his fellow citizens, that of the greatest of leaders among his friends, and that of the most fortunate even among his enemies. Sulla was finally rewarded his first consulship in 88 BCE, but this would come after the famous Mithridatic Wars, which would put Sulla on the map. And once again, the reason why I selected him as the true winner of the Game of Thrones. In the east, Mithridates Eupator of Pontus was causing problems, and his kingdom would rise up as the Seleucids would fall, as the Parthians would rise, and as the Ptolemies would kind of chilling out down in Egypt. Mithridates was the real deal at this time. And so, in 104 BCE, Mithridates invaded the provinces of Galatia and Paphlagonia, and after an invasion of nearby Bithynia, he withdrew when issued a warning by the Roman Senate. However, he soon disregarded the warning and attacked 3 Roman legions sent against him. He had all Italian residents' property confiscated and ordered the locals to kill all Italians. The end result was economic chaos, bankruptcy for many in Rome. Sulla, the hero, would rise and was given the command of the Roman forces to face this evil enemy, Mithridates. However, the tribune, Publius Sulpicius Rufus, blocked the order and, calling the elderly Marius out of retirement, awarded the command to him instead of Sulla. Marius was nearly 70 at the time, entered the fray, embittered, seeking vengeance. Sulla was irate. Not only was possibly victory stolen from him, the fame, the triumph, the glory taken from Sulla and given to Marius, but the spoils of war as well, the riches, the money, the gold. So realizing that Sulla had the support of the army, 6 legions, 30,000 men, he said, you know what? I'm going on my own. And so, as Plutarch writes, Sulla shouted orders to set fire to the houses, and seizing a blazing torch, led the way himself, and ordered his archers to use their firebolts and shoot them up at the roofs. This he did not from any calm calculation, but in a passion, and having surrendered to his anger the command of his actions, made his entry by the aid of fire, which made no distinction between the guilty and the innocent. Now, with fighting breaking out in the streets and the Senate against him, Sulla realized his best decision was to withdraw to the east and win battles to get famous. He escaped the city with the 6 legions, chose to march against Mithridates. Marius returned to Rome, initiating 5 days of murder and plunder, where he was again declared consul, only to die shortly afterwards in 86. Many of Sulla's supporters were executed. The rebellious Sulla, now angry, refused to obey a summons to return to the city and face a trial. At the urging of the consul Cinna, who is the uncle of Julius Caesar, the Roman Senate declared him an enemy of the state and condemned him to death. Ignoring all of this, Sulla continued eastward, and not only did he defeat Mithridates, but crushed the rebellion in Greece and conquered Athens for the Romans. Sulla was now paving the way for Pompey and Caesar to win glorious battles all over the Roman Empire. And while he was in Athens, he earned a reputation for his ruthlessness by granting his men permission to pillage and murder as they saw fit, eventually destroying the very groves where the great philosophers Plato and Aristotle had reflected on the human condition. Even the ancient symbol of Athens, the Acropolis, was plundered. He would campaign for 5 years. When Sulla returned to Rome in 83 BCE, he took his army and crossed the Rubicon. Yes, Sulla crossed the Rubicon nearly 40 years before Caesar would do it. Sulla did everything Caesar did before Caesar did. In fact, Caesar would be brought in front of Sulla as Sulla sat as the dictator of the Roman Republic. And Sulla had the choice to kill Caesar because of his uncle Cinna or free him. And he decided to free him. And so Julius Caesar was at his knees in front of Sulla, life in his hands. Sulla was more powerful than Julius Caesar. And Julius Caesar at this time was extremely powerful too. He was Rex Sacrorum, the highest priesthood that is available in the Roman religion. Sulla would rip this from him and not let him serve. Caesar would have to wait until the death of Sulla for him to run as the Pontifex Maximus, which would then become the highest priesthood. And the Roman Rex Sacrorum was out of service all the way until the time of Augustus. Sulla had promised that after Rome would reach its destination of the civil wars, uprisings of the borders, after he completed his duties as a general, he had promised to take away his dictatorship and give it back to the Republic. This is something that Julius Caesar also did as well, before he was murdered in the Senate floor. However, this didn't happen with Sulla. Sulla actually did give up his dictatorship and lived out his days in retirement in the city of Puteoli, Italy, where he would take all of his riches, and he had a boyfriend who was a famous musician and actor in plays named Metrobius. And they would live out their days as drunken Bacchants, reveling and living it up until they died. Sulla would live till 60 years old. The last 2 years of his life was not a dictator. He was still doing political affairs up until his last week of his life, but he was not in the Roman Senate and had nothing to do with being a dictator in his last 2 years. He did actually come through on his promise to give up his dictatorship, and his generals, Crassus and Pompey, immediately, just like the beginning of our story, when Alexander died, would begin their battles and start off the next round of civil wars that would end up being the chasing of Spartacus and Caesar invading Gaul, Pompey invading Judea, conquering Egypt, and Sulla, in my opinion, basically lays down the blueprint, if you will, for people like Caesar to come along and follow what Sulla laid down. Caesar would win the civil war against Pompey. Rome would rise and take over all the Mediterranean, stretching all the way to Babylon. Crassus would die fighting in Babylon, trying to take over the final frontier of this massive empire that everybody wants. And Julius Caesar would be killed in the Senate floor. The conspirators would divide up the empire between themselves, but it wasn't long, within a year, as the adopted son of Caesar, who's later known as Augustus, would rise up, take control with the help of Mark Antony and Lepidus, start what is known as the Second Triumvirate, arrest and kill all the conspirators who killed Caesar. And then another civil war would break out between Augustus and Mark Antony. Mark Antony is compared with Demetrius the Soter by Plutarch. And this is a really interesting parallel that Plutarch lays out, because both of them are called Dionysus, and they both have a lot of luck until the end. They're both very successful until the end, where they are defeated by their rivals. And so Mark Antony is defeated by Augustus, and finally peace reigns at last. The Game of Thrones is finally over, and Augustus reigns for 40 years. And in fact, that last battle with the Parthians and Crassus, that didn't go well for Rome. The Parthians would actually decide that it was better to bend the knee to Augustus. They gave back the standards that were taken from Crassus. Augustus makes a peace treaty with them. And to just put a cherry on top, King Porus of India, who has the same name as the King Porus who was king of India during the time of Alexander, would send diplomats all the way from India to meet with Augustus and to give tribute and give presents. One of them actually was initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries with Augustus. I just thought that'd be a cherry to throw on top to show what kind of power, what kind of respect this August one would have. And Julius Caesar would be deified and remembered as the great bringer of this empire. But in all actuality, in my opinion, Sulla is the one who set everything up for the Caesars. And without Sulla, none of this would happen. Nobody would get the idea to cross a Rubicon. The groundwork would not be laid out. There's no blueprint to do any of this stuff if Sulla doesn't come along. And that is the point of my video. Sulla, in my opinion, was the true winner of the Game of Thrones. And the reason why is because nobody killed him or defeated him. He decided that his time was up and that he actually gave up his dictatorship and lived out his life retired as a Bacchic reveler with a bunch of playwriters and musicians living out their days in bliss as winners, as true victors over the politics. And even Augustus, after how successful and lucky Augustus was, he would go to his deathbed angry about his legions in the north that lost to the Germans. And so the reason why I bring this up is because there is no end of this story. The empires keep fighting. They keep being invaded by barbarians. There is no end of this cycle. This cycle continues forever. War doesn't stop. Russia is invading Ukraine right now. The Middle East is not stable. America is taking its fair share of resources from third world countries. And that's the way it is, and that's the way it's going to be. And so, I look at Sulla, the only person who has ever really did this and said, and had the level of power, had the dictatorship in his hands, but didn't die with it, and actually selected and chose to take away with it, give it back to the Roman Republic. And so, he is my choice for the winner of the real Game of Thrones.